Okay, so this is question 4 on the Unit 6 quiz. What we have here is a cone, and we want to find the volume, but we're missing some of the critical pieces of information that we need. Now, I'm going to start by writing the volume formula for a cone. So the volume of a cone is equal to either 1/3 pi r squared h, or you can write it pi r squared h over 3, like either of those are accurate. And so notice what we need here is a height and a radius. Okay. In this problem, let me zoom in a little bit. In this problem, we're given neither of those things. So we have an angle here and we have the side of the cone. But imagine that if I draw the height in here and the radius, those are the two things that we need. We have a right triangle basically on the inside of this cone. So I'm going to draw that right triangle down here. So something like this. Okay, and this we know is 13. That's like the outside of the cone. And then we don't know this, but when we find it, it's going to be the height, and this is going to be the radius of the circular base of the cone that we need. We also know that this angle right here is going to be half of 46. So this full angle is 46, and we just kind of cut it in half. And so this angle right here is 23 degrees. So in order to find h and r, height and radius, we need to use trig ratios. Okay, so if you go back to this idea, SOHCAHTOA, this tells us that sine is the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse, cosine is the ratio of the adjacent side over the hypotenuse, and tangent is the ratio of the opposite side over the adjacent. And we're labeling those in reference to this 23 degree angle. So this side is the opposite side, right? It's like across from that angle. This is the adjacent side, and this is the hypotenuse over here. Okay, so if I want to find h, for example, notice I'm using the adjacent side, h, and I'm going to use the hypotenuse, which is 13. Okay, so the trig function that uses adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. Okay, so the cosine of 23 degrees, a 23 degree angle, is equal to the ratio of the adjacent side, which we will call h for height of this cone, over the hypotenuse, which in this case is 13. Okay, solving for height, which is what we want, we're going to multiply both sides by 13, and we're going to get height equals 13 cos 23. Okay, now if you punch that into your calculator, you're going to get an irrational number. So 13 times cosine of 23, right? It's this ugly number. Okay, we don't want to round this number yet, because if we round this number now and we multiply it a bunch of times, we're going to multiply our rounding error. So if you round it to 12, say, you're like, oh, 12, that's only off by like, 0.1 or something like that. That's true. But if you take that 12 and with that rounding error and you multiply, you're going to be off by more at the end of the problem. So we don't want to round that number yet. We're just going to leave it as 13 cos 23. Okay, we also need to find the radius. And so for the radius, side here is going to be the opposite side. And again, we're going to use the only other side we know that's a nice number is the hypotenuse. So the trig function that uses opposite and hypotenuse is sine. So the sine of the 23 degree angle is equal to the ratio of the opposite side, which we labeled r for radius, over the hypotenuse, which we know is 13. Again, solving for r, like we solved for h, we're going to multiply both sides by 13, and we're going to get that the radius is 13 times the sine of 23 degrees. Okay, again, that's going to be an ugly number, irrational, so let's not do anything with that yet. Let's just leave it, and then we'll plug it all in at the same time. Okay, so notice now we have h and r. Okay, we have the two things that we need, h and r, to find the volume of this cone. So we're going to put it all together. Okay, so the volume of the cone is equal to pi times the radius squared. So this is going to be 13 sine 23, that's the radius, and that whole thing needs to be squared. Okay, so it's radius squared times h, which is 13 times cosine of 23, and all that stuff is going to be divided by 3 or multiplied by 1/3. Okay, so this is like kind of like the exact answer here, everything else is going to be kind of messy, and we don't want to round it to the very end. Okay, so now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this one piece at a time. Okay, so let's start out with this guy. Okay, 13 sine 23. So 13 sine 23, right? Okay, that's what it is. I don't want to round that. That's the radius. Don't round it. What we're going to do is we're going to square it. So I'm going to use my squared button. Okay, so now that's the radius squared. Okay, I need to multiply that whole thing by 13 cos 23. So I'm going to multiply that answer times 13 times the cosine of 23. Again, I'm not rounding at all. I mean, the calculator has to round a little bit because it can't hold more than like 10 digits or so, but we're keeping this as accurate as possible. Okay, so now I got that part. So I did this part, I did the square part, I did this part. Okay, I still need to multiply it by pi, which is another irrational number. Whoops. Whoa. Let's get rid of that. So we need the answer times pi. Okay, so let me get that guy, and then the last thing is divide it by 3. Okay, and we're not really rounding at all as we go. Okay, so 323.326. Okay, so that's a pretty accurate. This is still an approximation. This isn't an exact answer because remember, number's irrational. But it's like this is the exact answer, but this is a lot closer than we would get if we would have rounded all along the way. Okay, now at the very, very end, now that we're all done, now we can round to the nearest tenth. Okay, and we should get something like that. Okay, so that's how you do that problem. If you weren't sure how to do that, I would go back and look at your homework because there was a question just kind of similar to this on your homework assignment from this section. So you want to make sure that you understand what's happening here, that you understand trig ratios and how to find missing pieces. But the main thing that I think most students were having issues with is not the trig, it was rounding. They were rounding way too early, like rounding this number, but take a look at this guy, right? Like, just as an example. Let's do 13, or let's just do sine 23, right? Sine 23. Okay, this is going to give us kind of an ugly answer, but if I imagine rounding that to 0.4, that doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Just round it to 0.4, no big deal. But what's going to happen is when you round that to 0.4, you're going to multiply that by 13, and then you're going to square it, and then you're going to multiply that by this guy and by pi. So you're like you're taking your rounding error that seems like not a big deal, and you're multiplying it multiple times by different things, or squaring it or whatever, which means your rounding error is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as you go. So one of the keys to this problem is keeping your answer exact as long as possible until the very, very end so that you don't compound your rounding error as you go. Okay? The very end, then you can round, but if you round too early, you're going to be off by way more than 0.1. Okay, hope that helps.